In 1903, in a sparsely populated section of southern Montana, a woman confined to the Winfield State Convalescent Home began attracting attention from administrators. Staff claimed she could speak fluently in languages she had never studied. Over the course of several months, the patient became the focus of a controversial internal inquiry. What began as a curious medical puzzle evolved into a bureaucratic standoff involving state auditors, linguistics experts, and psychiatric overseers. By the time the investigation concluded, records were sealed and no formal statement was issued. What survived were fragments, staff memos, discharge forms, and a language evaluation log never meant to be made public. The Winfield State Convalescent Home in early 20th century Montana was known locally for its tranquil surroundings and rigid institutional protocols. Designed for long-term recovery and housing of non-violent individuals deemed mentally unfit for employment, the facility operated under the auspices of the Montana Board of Sanitary Affairs. Publicly, Winfield was praised for its cleanliness discipline and apparent progressive outlook on convalescent care. Its leadership often participated in medical conferences and published data on patient behavior and recovery timelines. But little was ever said about patient 64B. Internally, the case was marked as anomalous and was quietly removed from all official reports. The Winfield State Convalescent Home was located 6 miles from the nearest railway stop, situated on a plateau just east of the Absaroka Range. Access was limited to a dirt road maintained by county funds and used mainly by supply wagons. The original facility had been a ranch house converted in 1887 for temporary housing of tuberculosis patients. By 1895, it had transitioned into a more permanent medical holding center, drawing administrative oversight from Helena and funding through a series of legislative grants focused on mental rehabilitation. Its reputation among medical officers was based not on innovation, but compliance. Winfield followed state protocols closely, adapting policy changes within the allotted fiscal year and submitting clean audit trails during biannual inspections. A key feature of its operations was the orderly structuring of its patient population. Individuals were categorized not by diagnosis, but by functionality, resulting in a layout of wards grouped by linguistic, motor, and domestic capability. This allowed for more efficient staffing and minimized complications during oversight visits. The administrative director in 1903 was Dr. Felix Moran, an alumnus of the Iowa State Sanitary Academy. His appointment had been unremarkable, confirmed during a session of the Montana Board of Sanitary Affairs without dissent. Dr. Moran's record was consistent: low turnover among attendants, stable budgets, and no incidents requiring state intervention. His strengths lay in his predictability and fluency in administrative routines. Under his tenure, Winfield recorded a 6-year period with no public complaints or internal citations. This pattern of stability was one of the reasons the initial intake of patient 64B did not cause alarm. According to intake logs dated February 19, 1903, the patient was transferred from a small private sanitarium in Billings that had recently reduced operations. She was listed under the name Edith L., age approximated at 39, with no listed family. Her referral stated, "exhibits persistent delusional speech patterns in non-native tongues." No prior linguistic training or multilingual background was recorded. The intake physician's note included only, "speech deviates from Montana-acquired norms, consistent but contextually inconsistent." Her arrival at Winfield occurred with no public record beyond standard transportation charges filed through the Montana Public Health Ledger. She was placed in Ward C, which at the time was designated for self-sufficient female patients with no known violent or disruptive behaviors. Attendant notes during the first week describe her demeanor as compliant. She followed instructions, responded to basic questions, and maintained hygiene without assistance. However, 3 separate attendants logged that she gave answers in what appeared to be varying foreign languages. The first to report it formally was Clara Eames, an employee of 5 years and one of the ward's more senior attendants. Her March 10 memo to head matron Bessinger included the following excerpt. Patient 64B answers direct questions clearly, but alternates between tongues. The language varies. When prompted to repeat, she will either continue fluently or shift again. Responses are calm, consistent, and contextually in line with what is being asked. I do not believe this is mimicry. Dr. Moran authorized an internal evaluation under the premise of record clarification. The initial review was conducted by administrative aide William Hargreaves, who possessed intermediate training in Latin and French. His report, filed March 5th, noted that while the patient answered common queries with recognizable syntax, the languages appeared to range well beyond French or Latin. One conversation was partially translated and suspected to be Hungarian, another possibly Mandarin. Neither language was taught or spoken within the facility. The case escalated not through urgency, but paperwork. Weekly summaries from Ward C began referencing linguistic deviation, a phrase that had no predetermined category in the facility's reporting schema. Hargreaves, lacking the authority to classify linguistic phenomena as pathological, deferred to the State Board for procedural advice. In doing so, he inadvertently initiated a request for external review. A letter was sent from Helena on March 18th, signed by Sanitary Review Officer Edwin L. Copperthwaite. It authorized a 2-day visit by Professor Jules Bertram, a linguistics instructor from the State Normal School in Dillon. Bertram's function was framed as observational and non-invasive. His arrival on March 24th was logged as routine. Bertram conducted 6 interviews with patient 64B over a span of 36 hours. Each session took place in the Ward C interview room, monitored by one attendant and logged by hand. The transcripts, preserved in partial form, indicate that the patient responded fluently in what Bertram categorized as at least 13 distinct languages. He identified recognizable phrases in Greek, Finnish, Swahili, Dutch, Turkish, and others not native to any staff member. In his final statement, Bertram concluded, "Fluency observed, no accent detectable, syntax correct, cannot identify source of acquisition. Patient shows no awareness of code switching. Further review advised." No disciplinary action followed. Dr. Moran's written response to the board emphasized continued observation, but no disruption to routine. However, from this point forward, the patient was assigned private meals, and her interactions were limited to 2 designated staff members, one of whom had basic Latin comprehension. Requests to relocate her to a linguistic research facility in Spokane were submitted, but never approved. The reason cited was jurisdictional ambiguity. Patient 64B was not considered dangerous, and thus no relocation protocol matched her condition. As April progressed, further observations accumulated. Attendants recorded that the patient responded to notes written in languages she should not have known. She corrected mispronunciations when spoken to in French, asked a nurse about news from Prussia, and commented on the price of tea in Canton when shown a shipment invoice. Yet she never claimed knowledge of these languages. When questioned, she insisted she had lived only in Montana, had never left the territory, and had no formal education beyond age 10. These inconsistencies were not disruptive, but they became a matter of bureaucratic difficulty. The State Board began requesting that Winfield either assign her a classification or remove her from standard rotation. Dr. Moran, unwilling to declare her fraudulent or unwell without precedent, created a provisional status known as Category E, Interpretive Capacity Undetermined. It was a placeholder designation that appeared only in her files and one draft of the 1903 annual report that was later revised. Within the facility, the case became a curiosity rather than a source of concern. Some staff attempted brief exchanges with her in languages they only half remembered from school books. Others avoided conversation entirely, citing discomfort. Patient 64B showed no indication of distress and adhered to all routines. Her bedding was made without reminders, her meals consumed quietly, and her charts remained clean. No medication was administered beyond standard dietary supplements. The only significant irregularity occurred in late May when a visiting supply contractor reported hearing the patient speak to him in near-perfect Basque. He claimed he had grown up in a Basque-speaking family in Idaho and that her speech was indistinguishable from home. His statement was written on the reverse of a delivery invoice and filed with the front office, where it remained until the facility was audited the following year. By summer, patient 64B was receiving only limited interaction. Her case was discussed internally once per month under the heading Unresolved, and she was quietly excluded from language-related surveys sent by the State Board. Professor Bertram submitted a second request for visitation in July, but received no reply. The State Office declined to pursue follow-up, citing allocation priorities. Her chart remained active, but the entries became briefer and more mechanical. Descriptors were replaced with shorthand. She became, in practice, part of the background. By late June of 1903, internal attention to patient 64B had diminished, but references to her case continued to circulate in clerical correspondence. Most of these were low-priority memos requesting clarification on data classification, particularly in relation to new patient intake forms. A marginal note from the ward bookkeeper questioned whether her condition required the creation of a new column under behavioral anomalies. The question was never answered. Her daily routine remained consistent. She awoke with the ward bell, dressed independently, and was present at the dining hall at precisely 6:45 a.m. Staff noted that she often lingered near the south window during meal preparation, watching the hillside without comment. Her food preferences were neutral, and she requested no substitutions. There were no reported conflicts with other patients. When addressed in English, she responded in kind, though occasionally she would pause before replying, as if verifying which language was being used. Only one attempt was made during this period to test her abilities under controlled conditions. At Dr. Moran's direction, a visiting notary brought excerpts from legal texts in multiple languages. These included civil codes in Portuguese, tax filings in Armenian, and property agreements in Siamese. The documents were placed before her without commentary, and she was asked to interpret them. According to the notary's affidavit, she translated each passage correctly, adjusting for regional idioms and temporal variations in terminology. She did not ask for clarification or context. The notary's report was received on July 3rd and filed under Linguistic Evaluation, Subject 64B. It was one of the few documents that retained its original labeling throughout multiple audits. However, it was never cited in formal reports. Dr. Moran placed a handwritten note in the margin, "No breach of conduct, considered stable." Despite the precision of her responses, she was never asked to teach or instruct others. The facility did not have a pedagogical infrastructure, and there were concerns about formalizing a patient's role within institutional hierarchy. Staff were reminded during a quarterly meeting that patients could not be employed, even informally, without approval from the State Board. A memorandum dated July 12th clarified that no facility staff should engage in extended linguistic exchanges with 64B outside of necessary interaction. By August, references to her condition began to decrease in written reports. Her chart entries focused on diet, temperature, and sleep. Notations regarding speech patterns became sporadic. One attendant wrote simply, "No change." Another wrote, "Responds calmly. Language mixed." A third wrote nothing, leaving the column blank. The decision to reduce engagement was not formalized in any directive, but it followed a clear trend. When the State Board's summer inspectors arrived on August 21st, they spent only 6 minutes reviewing her file. No interview was conducted. The facility passed its inspection with a 98.4% compliance rating, and the report made no mention of any anomalies in Ward C. The only recommendation was to reinforce the north fence line due to erosion. That autumn, Winfield resumed its normal rhythm. Staffing patterns remained steady. The annual budget was approved without amendment. Several older patients were discharged, and 3 new arrivals were placed in Ward A. In a staff meeting on September 9th, Dr. Moran presented figures showing an 11% increase in meal efficiency and a 6% decrease in incident reports. The presentation concluded without questions. Patient 64B continued her routines uninterrupted. Her interaction was reduced to less than 30 words per day. She spent most afternoons in the ward garden, where she would sit on the stone bench nearest the tool shed. Occasionally she would be observed mouthing words to herself, though without sound. No staff member was assigned to document this behavior. One file remained open, a request from Professor Bertram to publish a paper referencing the case. His draft, titled Unverified Polyglossia in Isolated Environments, was submitted to the Montana Bureau of Institutional Records for approval. The request included a disclaimer stating no identifying information would be used. The Bureau denied permission, citing confidentiality policy and lack of medical verification. Bertram was instructed not to use patient examples from state-run facilities without formal release. In response, Bertram mailed a copy of his original transcripts to a private linguistic association based in St. Louis. The association replied that without corroborating witnesses or the patient's consent, the material could not be reviewed under peer guidelines. The file was marked inconclusive and returned to sender. Meanwhile, a separate internal memo was issued from the State Bureau of Personnel Stability. It listed patient 64B as a non-liability subject, a designation used for individuals who posed no financial risk or institutional strain. Under this label, no further inquiry was required unless initiated by external audit. The classification removed her from quarterly review. A letter sent by the Montana Board of Sanitary Affairs in October 1903 stated that no further resources would be allocated to unresolved linguistic anomalies unless accompanied by behavioral complications or administrative irregularities. Winfield acknowledged receipt but did not reply. By winter, the patient's presence had become normalized. Her chart required no updates. Her meals were delivered by rote. Staff no longer attempted interaction beyond procedural questions. The ward routine adjusted to her rhythm rather than the other way around. One night attendant noted in passing that she speaks as if reciting. No follow-up was filed. The year closed with a standard inventory of institutional assets. Patient 64B was listed under active residence with no outstanding assessments. Her file was placed in the low-priority cabinet of the records room. It remained there until the facility underwent reclassification in 1910. When the 1903 annual summary was submitted to Helena, the case was absent. No mention was made of linguistic irregularity, external review, or any special designation. The final line of her entry read, "Routine satisfactory. No deviations reported." In January of 1904, an internal memorandum was circulated among the supervisory staff of Winfield State Convalescent Home regarding compliance audits for linguistic uniformity. Though directed broadly at administrative routines, the circular made indirect reference to non-standard verbal conduct and advised pre-inspection reviews of any files where this may have been documented. The timing coincided with a request from the Helena Bureau of Statistical Integrity, which had begun cross-referencing institutional reports statewide. The purpose was to identify inconsistencies in patient data used for federal grant applications. Patient 64B was not named, but her file fell within the category specified by the directive. Assistant Bookkeeper Ira G. Ludlow reopened her chart and drafted a short evaluation of her record history. It contained no new observations, but concluded with a sentence that proved unusual. Verbal conduct classified internally, but without source document supporting classification. The note was forwarded to Dr. Moran's office. Dr. Moran requested clarification. Ludlow responded that the patient's unusual abilities were never officially encoded in the state ledger, because they were internally deemed stable and not requiring intervention. Moran countered that all observations were to be traceable to primary documentation. A brief dispute followed over whether the language evaluations conducted by Professor Bertram had been appended to the official chart or merely filed separately. The resolution was inconclusive. The transcript folder could not be located in the central records drawer. Clerk Nancy Walsh, responsible for re-indexing files after the 1903 reorganization, later testified that she remembered a folder labeled Bertram External Linguistic Addendum being placed in drawer 3C, but noted that the entire drawer had been removed during fumigation procedures in November. No record was kept of its temporary storage. The contents were presumed intact and returned, but Bertram's folder was not among the items reshelved. No attempt was made to locate a duplicate copy. This gap in documentation might have gone unnoticed had it not coincided with a separate request from the Office of Regional Medical Integration. A regional census had flagged Winfield as having the lowest patient rotation rate in the district, and 64B's name appeared on a short list of cases exceeding the median duration of confinement. A representative named J. Allen Norfleet was dispatched to investigate cases with ambiguous designations. He arrived at Winfield on February 6th and requested interviews with patients classified under provisional categories. Upon being shown the records for 64B, Norfleet asked to review the documentation of her intake and language assessments. Staff provided what remained, which included the original intake form and a handful of progress entries. The absence of the linguistic transcripts was explained as clerical error. Norfleet proceeded with a basic interview, conducted in English and recorded in brief shorthand. He later described her demeanor as consistent, cooperative, and without signs of cognitive disarray. His written summary included the phrase, "speech clear," no indication of confusion or ideation. However, Norfleet's report contained a detail not previously recorded. He noted that when he greeted her in German, she replied not only fluently, but also with syntax consistent with pre-Weimar regional dialects. He described it as the sort of phrasing my grandfather used, not the kind seen in schools or printed texts. When asked about her background, she again stated she had never lived outside Montana and had no formal education in any language other than English. This observation, though minor in tone, was passed along to the State Office of Anomalous Reports. The office did not follow up. Their reply, issued on February 13th, stated that the condition, though of potential interest, remains outside actionable thresholds without institutional conflict or procedural failure. Winfield was advised to continue its internal documentation, but not to escalate further. Nonetheless, Norfleet's visit led to renewed conversations among staff, particularly those with previous exposure to the case. Clara Eames, the attendant who had first reported the language irregularities a year earlier, submitted a note suggesting that the patient's linguistic range may have increased. She cited a brief encounter in the corridor where 64B had inquired about the temperature using phrasing associated with maritime Norwegian. Eames had once worked in a coastal post office in Bergen and claimed the construction was not standard textbook Norwegian. Dr. Moran, while reluctant to reopen inquiry, authorized a new evaluation to be conducted internally. He assigned the task to Conrad Elby, a junior clerk with experience cataloging medical terminology. Elby's task was limited: observe the patient over a 2-week period, document any non-English responses, and classify languages when possible. Elby began his observations on February 20th using a fixed list of basic questions translated into multiple languages via reference materials kept in the facility's storage library. His results were consistent with earlier findings. The patient responded fluidly to questions posed in French, Polish, Arabic, and Tagalog. Elby, using phonetic comparison, confirmed that her syntax matched regional norms and included idiomatic expressions that were not present in his reference materials. She displayed no uncertainty or hesitation. He noted she never initiated conversation, but responded promptly when addressed. One afternoon, Elby posed a question in classical Latin, using terminology from a Roman medical manuscript. She responded with what he recorded as unaccented, accurate classical reply, adjusting verb tense correctly for context. The significance of this was unclear, as the question had been obscure and technical. She made no comment on the source or subject matter. Elby's report concluded, she demonstrates no curiosity regarding the language used. She simply replies as if unaware of variation. Dr. Moran read the report, but took no action. The language used in the evaluation avoided diagnostic labels, and the case remained non-disruptive. However, the report did lead to a request for record re-evaluation by the State Records Bureau. They questioned the validity of the Category E designation, as no other patient in the state shared that classification. The Bureau suggested reclassifying her under miscellaneous non-communicative, though this was countered by staff. who pointed out she was communicative and compliant. As the administrative dispute played out, a new pattern began to appear in attendant records. 3 separate entries in March described the patient speaking briefly in languages that attendants could not identify. These entries were terse and included phrases such as "not in registry" and "syntax unknown." An effort to determine the origin of these phrases led to no resolution. LB revisited these encounters and was unable to trace 2 of the languages to any in the facility's reference collection. This marked the first time internal documentation acknowledged speech outside of existing classification. The entries did not indicate concern, but raised procedural challenges. Without a method for coding unknown languages, staff were instructed to write UL, unverified language, in daily logs. This shorthand appeared 6 times between March 10th and March 31st. Despite this, no escalation occurred. The lack of behavioral issues prevented the case from reaching higher review. Dr. Moran noted in a margin comment, "Absent disruption, inquiry not prioritized." The patient remained in Ward C, continued to receive meals at the standard hour, and spent most days in silent compliance with all facility expectations. On April 2, 1904, an internal administrative bulletin from the Office of Institutional Metrics was circulated statewide, requiring all long-term care facilities to conduct a resident status verification audit. The stated objective was to ensure that no patient remained under indefinite care without a recent review of function, conduct, and reassessment of classification. Facilities were given 30 days to submit verification logs, which would then be consolidated into the biennial federal compliance summary. At Winfield, the directive was received with minimal disruption. Patient files were retrieved from the central archive and assigned to clerks for review. Most patients were confirmed under standard designations within hours. The case of 64B was flagged only due to her provisional category. Conrad Elby, still listed as her file steward, was instructed to verify her classification and submit a formal summary of current status. Elby reviewed the most recent entries and noted the persistence of UL codes. He consulted the facility's reference collection again and found no match for 3 of the entries made in March. Unable to confirm classification with the materials available, he prepared a memorandum requesting temporary delay in verification until outside review could be obtained. Dr. Moran rejected the request, stating that external validation was not necessary if the patient showed no behavioral change and that internal documentation would suffice under Clause 4C of the Audit Directive. On April 9th, Elby submitted a provisional verification summary. It described 64B as consistently responsive, linguistically irregular, and non-disruptive. The classification Category E was retained with the annotation "Pending Future Review." The summary was accepted without revision and filed with the audit log. That same week, an unconnected event brought minor attention back to the patient. A shipment of medical literature arrived at Winfield from a district archive in Helena. Among the texts was a volume of early surgical history written in Old Church Slavonic. It had been misfiled with anatomical references and was meant for redistribution to a regional medical school. Before its transfer, the book was temporarily shelved in the facility's reading room. Attendant Mary Ellison later documented that 64B was seen leafing through the volume during her designated library hour. Ellison claimed the patient appeared to be reading, moving her lips silently as she turned the pages. The book had not been catalogued for general circulation and contained no illustrations. When Ellison approached and asked if the patient could understand the text, 64B answered in English, "It is not difficult." No further comment was recorded. The book was retrieved that evening and transferred out of the facility as originally scheduled. No formal notation was made in the patient's chart regarding the incident. However, Ellison submitted a brief account to the ward supervisor, who initialed it without comment and filed it under miscellaneous observations. By late April, the patient's interactions remained consistent, though the UL notation appeared with increasing frequency. 2 attendants reported being addressed in unfamiliar speech while performing routine duties. Both noted that while they did not understand the content, The tone and structure suggested fluency. The utterances were brief, used in the context of greetings or acknowledgements, and always accompanied by neutral expression. On April 26th, a senior nurse attempted to engage the patient using printed flashcards in various languages. The cards included phrases in Danish, Persian, and Malay. The nurse later reported that 64B answered each card promptly, adjusted for grammatical tense, and added polite formality not printed on the card. The nurse's memo concluded with the sentence, "Her corrections are appropriate. She does not improvise. She responds as though the phrases are already familiar." Following this report, Dr. Moran authorized no further testing. His margin note read, "Confirmed as pattern. No procedural expansion warranted." The directive was relayed to staff, and language-based interaction was officially discouraged unless required for procedural communication. Despite this, references to speech anomalies persisted in daily logs. A night shift entry dated May 4th noted that the patient spoke in what was described as a structured phonetic form, possibly unlisted. The attendant noted that it did not resemble any known script and resembled rhythmic recitation. No further details were recorded. The event was not deemed significant. Later that month, an unsolicited letter arrived from Professor Jules Bertram. Though not directly tied to any institutional inquiry, the letter referenced his prior visit and requested an update on 64B's condition. He expressed continued academic interest and included several questions regarding her current communicative habits. The letter was received by Dr. Moran's office and acknowledged with a pre-written form response indicating that patient records were confidential and not available for academic inquiry. No further communication was entered into. On May 19th, an assistant clerk discovered a partial duplication in the record system. Patient 64B's intake form had been entered twice under two slightly different classifications, one as functional anomaly, the other as non-critical linguistic deviation. Both entries were dated February 1903 and matched the same intake date. The duplication had not been caught previously because only one file had been active. Clerical protocol required reporting duplicates to the State Registry Coordination Office. However, since the duplicate entry had not generated any additional documentation, the case was considered administratively dormant. Dr. Moran chose not to report it and instead marked the inactive record as resolved in pencil. The form was left in the file drawer without notation. As spring ended, the patient's behavior remained unchanged. She walked the perimeter of the garden in the same order each afternoon, paused in the same location near the southeast gate, and returned to her bench without deviation. She answered questions in English when addressed in English, and in other languages when prompted otherwise. She volunteered no unsolicited speech. The final entry of the season came from Conrad Elby on June 1st. It stated only, "Responses remain consistent. No evident stress. Language index expanding. Recommend archival stability unless prompted otherwise." The note was filed and no reply was issued. In July 1904, a procedural update was issued by the State Office of Convalescent Oversight requesting that all facilities submit examples of unique institutional classifications for review. The directive was part of a broader effort to streamline data collection ahead of the pending shift to consolidated state health records, which would be standardized under the Bureau of Public Filing. Each institution was instructed to submit its provisional categories along with a representative case file. Winfield submitted 8 classifications in total, including Category E, Interpretive Capacity Undetermined. Attached to the submission was a redacted summary of patient 64B's condition, which omitted her name but retained key observations regarding non-English speech. The document included no transcripts, behavioral incidents, or detailed interactions, citing unverified origin data. The submission was received by the Bureau without comment. A month later, in August, a follow-up letter arrived from the Bureau requesting additional clarification on the rationale behind the classification. Specifically, the review officer asked how a non-medical condition had been approved for formal categorization without prior clinical documentation. Dr. Moran drafted a reply stating that the classification had arisen from routine observational necessity and that the patient had not shown indicators requiring medical escalation. He attached a summary signed by Conrad Elby outlining the administrative history of the designation. The Bureau responded by inviting a review official to conduct an on-site visit. The representative, Adeline R. Vesco, arrived on August 15th with authorization to examine any files related to local classification protocols. She was not assigned to evaluate individual patients, but was permitted to review documents and observe ward procedures. Vesco's inspection began with the administrative offices. She conducted interviews with record clerks and reviewed ledgers for consistency. On the second day of her visit, she requested to see all current patients associated with non-standard designations. The list included 3 individuals, of which 64B was one. According to staff notes, Vesco was escorted to Ward C at 2:10 p.m. She met with the ward supervisor and then spoke briefly with the patient in the garden area. The exchange lasted under 5 minutes. Vesco's notebook included only a single line regarding the interaction: articulate, calm, responsive, non-English greeting confirmed. Following her return to Helena, Vesco filed a summary stating that the Category E classification lacked procedural backing, but that the case did not reflect mismanagement or deviation from standard oversight. However, she recommended that the classification be removed from the statewide system and any further instances be catalogued under the existing Communication Irregularities Code. No correction was mandated for prior use. The change in policy was minor, but created a discrepancy within Winfield's filing system. Patient 64B's designation was now obsolete. Dr. Moran directed that her file be updated to reflect the standard code, with a footnote indicating the previous classification. The revision was completed on September 4th. The internal response was procedural and did not affect her day-to-day treatment. Despite the formal reclassification, references to her condition began to decrease. Staff had grown accustomed to her presence, and most no longer remarked on her language usage. The notation UL appeared only once in September and was later crossed out by the supervisor, who replaced it with no change. It was during this period of stabilization that a new element entered the record: a discrepancy in patient correspondence logs. Winfield maintained a ledger of all incoming and outgoing mail involving residents. Though most patients received limited communication, each piece was logged with date, sender or recipient, and initials of the reviewing clerk. On September 12th, the clerk responsible for mail distribution logged an outgoing envelope under 64B's initials. The recipient section had been left blank. When questioned, the clerk said the envelope had been delivered by the patient, sealed, and dropped into the outgoing tray without comment. As per policy, the clerk opened the envelope prior to mailing. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing 6 lines written in a language that the clerk did not recognize. The paper was forwarded to the ward supervisor, who escalated it to Dr. Moran. He examined the document and instructed that it not be mailed. No formal explanation was provided. The paper was folded and placed in the patient's file under a subheading labeled Undelivered. Its contents were never translated or recorded in the chart. This incident remained isolated until a second envelope was logged on September 19th. Again, the contents were in an unknown language, sealed, and unsigned. The envelope bore no destination. A second note was added to the file. Dr. Moran repeated the prior directive: retain, do not process. A memorandum was issued to mail staff, instructing them to withhold any future correspondence from 64B for direct review. The repetition of the behavior prompted an informal meeting among select administrative staff. The discussion focused on whether the correspondence reflected a change in the patient's condition. Moran maintained that without disruptive behavior or medical irregularities, the activity did not warrant reclassification. The language remained unidentified, and no efforts were made to translate the messages. By October, a total of 4 such letters had been collected. All followed the same structure: brief, handwritten passages in languages not present in the facility's reference books, unsigned with no destination. None exceeded a single page. All were filed without transcription. Outside of these entries, the patient's conduct remained consistent. She followed institutional procedures, maintained a predictable routine, and responded clearly when addressed. The correspondence was not mentioned in her daily reports and was not discussed with her directly. Staff were instructed not to question her about the letters unless instructed by the administrative office. On October 23rd, a temporary audit assistant assigned to the facility records office noted an irregularity while reviewing Ward C logs. She found that one of the unidentified letters bore markings in a script that matched an appendix entry from a language classification manual housed at the State Archive. The entry, labeled Proto-Austro, referenced a proposed linguistic route used in comparative grammar studies, but had no living speakers and no known written samples beyond reconstructions. The assistant brought the similarity to the attention of Conrad Elby, who requested to see the manual. After comparing the letter with the appendix, he noted visual similarities, but could not confirm a match due to limited knowledge. He included a short note in the administrative record. Script resembles theoretical form, origin unknown, content untranslated. No action followed. The finding was not entered into the patient's file, as it did not constitute medical data and was not supported by a certified linguistic review. The letter was returned to the folder and retained under the existing heading. In early November, the final notation of the year was added to 64B's chart. It read, "Speech remains consistent. All responses appropriate. No procedural breach. Maintain current protocol." Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. On November 7, 1904, a review form was filed by Dr. Moran as part of Winfield's year-end self-assessment. Each ward was required to submit evaluations for a selection of patients flagged by the Bureau of Public Filing for long-term monitoring. Patient 64B was listed among these due to the duration of her institutionalization and the ambiguity of her current classification. Moran's response described her condition as unremarkable and affirmed that she required no special oversight. No mention was made of the letters or of linguistic anomalies. That same week, a visitor arrived unannounced at the facility gate. He identified himself as Charles Lemore, a field researcher affiliated with a private historical society based in Missouri. Lemore carried no official credentials, but claimed to be conducting a survey of linguistic phenomena in state institutions. He had heard about the case of 64B from Professor Bertram, who had shared general details without disclosing her name or location. Lemore's interest was framed as academic and passive. Due to the absence of credentials, access to the patient was denied. However, Dr. Moran agreed to meet with him for a brief consultation in the front office. Lemore asked several questions regarding patient routines, language testing procedures, and institutional categorization methods. He also inquired whether any written materials had been collected that might suggest unknown or extinct linguistic forms. Moran did not confirm or deny any specifics. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Lemore departed without incident, leaving behind a business card and a typed letter requesting notification should the institution reconsider. 2 days later, on November 9th, the facility experienced a routine inspection by a district auditor assigned to review documentation standards ahead of the upcoming records integration. While examining the patient files for Ward C, the auditor flagged a discrepancy in the labeling of secondary documents. The undelivered folder containing 64B's letters had not been cross-referenced in her primary chart and lacked the date stamps required for internal correspondence. According to regulation, any material removed from patient circulation had to be either destroyed or fully logged. The auditor issued a notice of administrative deviation. While minor, it required formal correction. The options were either to dispose of the letters and document their destruction, or to create an appendix within the patient's file with proper date tags and explanatory notes. Moran chose the latter. He directed that the letters be copied by clerical staff and assigned unique identifiers, with a notation that the originals were to be stored in a secure envelope labeled non-distributable. Conrad Elby was tasked with preparing the transcriptions. He completed 3 of the 4 letters without difficulty, noting their consistent structure, line spacing and penmanship. However, the fourth letter presented challenges. The characters did not correspond to any script in the facility's reference volumes, and several markings resembled ideographs rather than alphabetic forms. Elby attempted a phonetic rendering, but was unable to determine where one word ended and another began. He marked the transcript as approximate and added a notation: syntax non-standard, character grouping inconsistent with known forms. The transcription file was completed on November 13th and added to the patient's appendix. The originals were placed in a sealed envelope and stored in a separate file drawer designated for anomalous documentation. The correction was recorded in the deviation ledger and the audit notice was cleared. Over the following weeks, no further letters were submitted by the patient. Her behavior returned to routine and her interactions remained minimal. She continued to respond to questions as needed and participated in basic ward functions without deviation. Her chart noted no changes in demeanor, appetite, or sleep. However, an incident on December 3rd prompted renewed interest from administrative staff. During the evening census check, a substitute attendant entered a note stating that the patient had spoken a complete sentence in a language bearing similarity to early Himalayan tonal patterns. The attendant, who had spent part of her childhood in missionary surroundings in Darjeeling, claimed the cadence and intonation matched speech patterns associated with Tibetan dialects no longer in use. The sentence, written phonetically by the attendant, was later reviewed by Elby. While he could not verify the language, he noted a resemblance to phrasing structures listed in an obscure appendix of the Phonetic Classification Manual, specifically entries describing unverified tonal systems documented during British surveys of Central Asia in the mid-19th century. The manual itself offered no translation. No formal response was filed. Dr. Moran annotated the record with the phrase, "No breach, continue observation." The note was initialed and placed in the patient's file without requiring further review. By mid-December, the subject of 64B's condition once again faded from active discussion. The year-end reports prioritized financial tallies, supply chain summaries, and personnel assessments. Ward C received a satisfactory rating for conduct and stability. No patients were recommended for transfer or escalation. The patient's name appeared only once in the final summary, under the heading Long-Term Non-Escalated Cases. Her entry included the statement, "Remains compliant, routine interactions only, no special measures in place." On December 29th, Elby submitted a personal memo to Dr. Moran, suggesting the possibility of submitting anonymized samples of 64B's writing to an external archive for classification. He proposed contacting the Linguistic Collections Office at a university in Chicago that had recently published a compendium of unclassified writing systems. Moran did not respond. The memo was filed without annotation. The patient's chart remained open but unchanged through the end of the year. Her record showed no signs of distress, and no medication had been added or withdrawn. In the final daily report of 1904, the only notation under her name read, "Present at meals, sat by window, no irregularities. A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Repetir, the facility's administrative climate shifted in early 1905 following the appointment of a new state liaison for compliance review, Randall M. Hain, previously attached to the Bureau of Long-Term Policy Integration, began requesting detailed breakdowns of patient retention exceeding 36 months. His aim was to determine whether low discharge rates reflected institutional efficiency or procedural stagnation. Among the flagged entries was the file of 64B, whose classification remained non-medical and whose duration of residence was nearing its third consecutive year. Hain's review identified 3 gaps in documentation. First, her language capacity was not linked to a medical cause. Second, no follow-up evaluation had been conducted since 1903. Third, she had not received a full psychological assessment since her intake, which at the time had relied on handwritten notes from an out-of-county physician whose license had since lapsed. These findings prompted a directive to Winfield requesting a compliance update within 60 days. Dr. Moran reviewed the request and issued a series of internal memos assigning staff to revisit all case files flagged by the new directive. For 64B, he appointed LB to produce a revised behavioral summary and scheduled a consultation with the facility's part-time diagnostic examiner, Dr. Lester F. Minnock, who had been retained through a contractual agreement for periodic assessments. Minnock was informed of the patient's language profile and instructed to prepare a non-invasive cognitive evaluation suitable for low-disruption cases. The examination took place on February 15th. Minnock's notes documented her verbal acuity, recall, and contextual comprehension. He noted no aberrations in behavior, affect, or responsiveness. The evaluation, which lasted just over 1 hour, included language prompts in 6 controlled dialects. The patient answered each prompt fluidly, using terminology consistent with professional linguistic registers. At one point, Minnock introduced a constructed phrase, drawn from a fictional grammar used in linguistic modeling exercises. She responded as though it held actual meaning, producing a grammatically valid reply that conformed to the internal rules Minnock had intended only as a pedagogical tool. He made no interpretive statement beyond response matched structure. His report was forwarded to the state liaison, along with an updated classification sheet. The patient was designated under Non-Disruptive Communication Variants, a code approved for census filing in early 1905. With the new label applied, her case no longer stood out among long-term residents. Haynes' office acknowledged receipt and issued no further request. The modification was viewed as clerical, not substantive. In daily life, nothing changed for the patient. Her routine was left intact, her meals scheduled as before, and her speech remained unremarked by staff. The last UL notation in her file appeared in March, followed by a 3-month span with no linguistic observations logged. Her responses, while occasionally multilingual, had become so familiar to staff that no entry was made unless deviation occurred. The absence of further scrutiny led to a gradual disengagement. LB, previously the point of contact for her documentation, was reassigned to other record-keeping duties. The transcription appendix was never expanded, and the letters stored in the anomalous folder remained unopened after their initial review. No directive was given to revisit their content or format. When the facility underwent a partial audit in April, the file passed review without comment. Later that spring, a new procedural guideline issued by the state required that institutions begin preparing for full patient indexing under the Consolidated Bureau of Civic Records. Each file would need to include a verified origin form documenting date of intake, source institution, and any transfers between facilities. Winfield's compliance team began assembling packets for each long-term resident, focusing first on those whose intake predated 1904. In reviewing 64B's intake, staff discovered a discrepancy. The original intake sheet from 1903 listed her as a transfer from the Billings Private Convalescent Facility. However, when clerks contacted the Office of County Transfers to retrieve the associated records, they found no confirmation of her prior admission. The Billings facility, which had since closed, had left behind limited archival material, and no intake form bearing her name or initials was found. The only reference was a transportation invoice listing a generic patient transfer to Winfield on February 19, 1903. The absence of verifiable origin placed her file in non-compliance with the new indexing rules. A memo was submitted to Dr. Moran requesting clarification on how to proceed. He annotated the margin with retain classification, mark as administrative orphan, origin unverifiable. The notation allowed her file to remain active under a temporary status pending further instruction from the state. That instruction never arrived. In mid-June, the Bureau of Civic Records postponed implementation of the new index system until the following year. All non-critical updates were placed on hold. The temporary status remained in place, and her file was placed at the back of the current cabinet drawer. No significant entries were made for the remainder of the summer. Her health remained steady, and her schedule did not change. Ward staff rotated without issue, and only 2 new patients were added to Ward C. During a routine evaluation in August, the acting matron described her as low-profile, oriented, no recent requests. In September, Professor Bertram submitted a second unsolicited letter to the facility. He inquired whether the patient was still present, if her condition had evolved, and whether any written material had been preserved. He offered to assist with classification or transcription at no charge. The letter was reviewed by Dr. Moran, who declined to reply. It was folded and placed in the correspondence drawer, where it remained unacknowledged. As winter approached, facility records were again reviewed for budget planning. Patient 64B's file was marked as requiring no medication, no external services, and no dietary accommodations. Her annual cost per patient was the lowest in the ward. The ledger indicated full compliance with staffing ratios, behavior reporting, and food inventory requirements. Her case did not trigger any statistical anomaly. The final entry of the year came from a new ward attendant who had recently joined from a public health outpost in Kalispell. Her observation was routine. Patient quiet. Read during assigned hour. Responded in English. No anomalies noted. The following spring, in 1906, Winfield underwent administrative restructuring. Dr. Moran submitted his retirement notice and was replaced by interim director Hiram Vose. Under Vose, older patient records were recatalogued by intake number rather than surname. Patient 64B was renumbered, but her file remained unchanged. Her letters, transcriptions, and evaluations were moved into a drawer marked Legacy Unresolved, a category created for files deemed complete but lacking full historical traceability. By the end of 1906, no further updates had been made. The patient remained in residence through the decade's close. When the institution began microfilming records in 1910, her file was included without notation. The script samples, categorized as untranslatable, were preserved as part of the non-standard documentation series. None of the state's published reports mentioned her case. No further correspondence was received. The file was never removed, flagged, or reclassified again. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.